All right, guys, let's talk about the Restoration and the 18th century. So, the year 1660 marked Charles II's ascent to the English throne following more than a decade of exile, during which the country had experienced the Puritan rule of Oliver Cromwell's short lived Commonwealth. The period that immediately followed this return of the Stuart monarchs became known as the Restoration, because the Stuarts were restored to the throne. At the same time, in England and throughout Europe, other important changes led to the late 1600s and the 1700s being known as the Age of Reason. So, under Charles II, England turned its back on the grim era of Puritan rule and entered a lively period in which upper class social and political life copied the sophistication and splendor of the French court of Louis XIV. The upper classes attended elegant parties and enjoyed going to the theater, where they were amused by comedies of manners that poke fun at their own glamorous but artificial society. Charles was an astute politician, and his reign brought relative stability to England. A period of increased growth and prosperity began and led eventually to the growth of the English middle class. The Restoration brought about the realization that English monarchs would have to share their authority with Parliament, whose influence had increased substantially. Charles at first had widespread support in Parliament, weathering both the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London a year later. Soon, though, two factions arose that would become the nation's chief political parties: the Tories, who supported royal authority, and the Whigs, who wanted to limit royal authority. Political conflict increased after Charles' death in 1685. Charles had reestablished Anglicanism as the state religion, but his successor, James II, wanted England to return to Roman Catholicism. When Parliament forced James to abdicate in 1688, or to step down, the crown passed peacefully to his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William, demonstrating the power of Parliament over the monarchy. The next year, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights, which strictly limited royal authority. The first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, was appointed in 1721. The position of Prime Minister became influential, and although the monarchy remained, people recognized that the time of absolute monarchs was over. The period including the late 1600s and the 1700s is called the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, because it was during this time that people increasingly made use of scientific thought to understand the world. Sir Isaac Newton formulated the laws of gravity and motion and developed the scientific method, a process that scientists could use to test hypotheses about how the world works. Newton's findings suggested that the universe operates according to logical principles, an idea that inspired such philosophers as John Locke to apply the rules of logic and reasoning to human nature and society. During the 1700s, it became common for male writers, artists, politicians, and others to gather in public places and exchange ideas, conduct business, and share gossip. Educated women held private gatherings for the same purpose, so that they too could be included in the intellectual life of the day. More women started writing and publishing their work. Some, most notably Mary Wollstonecraft, became advocates for women's rights. The spirit of the Enlightenment brought about many improvements in living conditions. For example, the practice of inoculation against disease was introduced by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and a vaccine for smallpox was developed. The middle class grew and prospered, and ordinary men and women had more money, leisure time, and education than ever before. For writers, that meant a broad new audience eager to read and willing to pay for literature. The middle classes wanted writing that reflected their own concerns and experiences. Thus, prose journalism experienced a rise in popularity. Some nonfiction journalists, diarists, and letter writers turned to fictional topics, leading to the birth of the novel. While much poetry was at first still written in a classical style, toward the end of the 1700s, some poets began to move toward a simpler and freer poetic style. In the century to come, both prose and poetry would continue to evolve as the new era of Romanticism blossomed. So let's just take a look at a few key points on the timeline here. So basically, this is going to run from 1660 to 1800. 1660 is the Restoration, when the Stuart monarchy is restored. Then we have the Great Plague, the Great Fire. 1687, Sir Isaac Newton defines the law of gravity. John Locke, the philosopher, publishes his text. 1707, England, Wales, and Scotland unite as Great Britain, which it's still known as today. Let's see. The Prime Minister Walpole, that happened in 1721. 1755, Samuel Johnson's A Dictionary of the English Language is published. It's a pretty big development. 1763, Britain defeats France in the 7 Years' War, and they acquired French Canada. 1783, the independence of the United States is recognized in the Treaty of Paris. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman is published.